right. Dan, how's Ignite been for you this week?
Oh man, Cliff, this is my first Ignite. Reconnecting with old friends and making new ones is what it's all about. Definitely paying for it now, though. Appreciate the conference warriors that joined us this morning out here. I hope you all are feeling better than I am, but making it through a long week and getting a lot out of it.
Yeah, I've been on both sides, right? I've attended a lot of these and on the sponsor side as well, and you guys definitely have the harder job. Your brains are on constantly. You're forced to go to all these parties and carry those heavy bags of swag that, it's obligatory, right? You must do it.
A lot of socks, a lot of Legos.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff.
Got to be popular with my 8-year-old when I get back.
Yeah, I bet. Hopefully you win the Lego set. Yeah. I'm Cliff Embry. I'm Security Architect Manager at Varonis. So I manage a team of email and incident response security architects. But before that, I was a consultant for a top Microsoft partner for 15 years. In the back half of that was pretty focused on Defender, Purview, and Entra. Dan, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you plan to share today?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Dan Holland. I'm the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer at Tampa General Hospital. It's a $4 billion organization with 7 hospitals and 150 clinical locations across Florida, so an academic health system with a pretty diverse mission. I'm responsible for the cyber governance, risk, and compliance program, as well as the data protection program, which we stood up, and what we're here to talk about today, that work that we've done. Before that, my career started in federal law enforcement in the Coast Guard, and went and worked for a Fortune 500 company for a minute, and started my own company, and been doing that for 8 years before Tampa General hooked me, and absolutely fell in love with the team and the culture of that organization. It's been a really special ride.
Yeah, well, we're happy to have you as a client, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Classification is a core priority for our clients. They need to comply with those industry regulations like HIPAA, PCI, and GDPR, but they also need to respond to those internal and external audit requests. And I know that sounds very, very boring, but I promise it sets the foundation for some more exciting things, because they also want to protect their sensitive data and their intellectual property if there's an account compromise or in the event of a ransomware attack. So without a good inventory of what you have, it's difficult to know what to protect or what's been impacted in the event of a breach. So they need answers, and without an accurate classification, they're just not going to have those. And DLP is a major driver for classification as well. Companies struggle with DLP technologies that scan data right at the time that you send it out the door, so when it's in motion. And these are very limited, and we still have data that's getting out the door, and we have teams that are bogged down with false positives. And so Purview sensitivity labels are going to help bring that rich data at rest classification forward into your DLP engines, and that goes beyond Purview. So Dan, what motivated Tampa General Hospital to accurately classify and label data at scale?
Well, we're at a really pivotal time in healthcare, right? There's a very dynamic regulatory environment, societal changes, technological changes, and we're all experiencing that across industries, right? So that's not unique to healthcare. I think those forces are playing on all of us. But with the technological change in artificial intelligence, sorry to bring it up, but it's going to be a theme here, I think, if this week's any indicator. And I came across a quote that y'all may be familiar with. Back in 2018, Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, said that he expects AI to have the same impact on society as electricity. And it got me thinking about where we're at right now. And electricity didn't transform society overnight, right? It was dangerous, in the early days to use electricity. A lot of fires, a lot of damage. The value, the societal transformation came once we got standards, right? Once we settled on AC versus DC, once we got the wiring and the grounding and the circuit breakers standardized and understood the voltages and what we were trying to accomplish to use electricity, and that's where the value came from. So I think we're at that moment with artificial intelligence to put that foundation in place so that we can be successful with these tools. And that's really what's driven our drive here at the moment. Demands clarity and strong governance, and ultimately, under that, an understanding of who has access to this data, where is our data, because that's what these models are using, right? And that's where the value lies, but that's also where the risk lies. So we absolutely had to get our arms around it before we could start deploying the tools that the business is demanding that we deploy.
Yeah, yeah, we see that across the board. Our clients know that if a bad actor compromises an identity, they can cause endless damage because the blast radius is so large. And when I say blast radius, what I mean is what data does a single user have access to? Because most companies have hundreds, if not thousands, of data stores that don't have centralized visibility or control. And then we have end users and developers that can spin up team sites, SaaS apps, databases, and workloads. And AI is going to make this challenge more urgent and more complex because not only does it create data faster than humans, but it will inhale all of this sensitive data based on those user permissions. And so I've seen so many companies start projects to find their sensitive data and just slowly fail. Some technologies are depending on sampling and predictive scanning that only give half-baked and partial visibility. And just as bad when companies have terabytes and petabytes of data, like Tampa General, scans were never completing. And you're not going to believe this, Dan, but some of these technologies don't even give you a progress indicator, so you really don't know where you stand with classification ever. And I like to ask folks, how valuable would a full inventory of sensitive data actually be? Like, what would you actually do with it? Classification without action, it really yields little value, and it results in tickets and additional manual activities that we will never be able to keep up with. So at Varonis, we have something called the 3 C's, and this is really what you need to be successful with your classification and thus your data security, and that's complete, current, and contextual. So we need to fully scan our data from top to bottom, no sampling, no predictive scanning, no cutoff dates. And to stay current, we can't rely on the full classification scans. It's never going to work. We need a baseline with that full scan. And then we need activity-based approach to trigger our incremental scans. So if a file is modified or a newly file is uploaded, we don't need to rely on that full scan to quickly reclassify or classify that new data. We just need to reclassify those specific resources. And then context. This is the biggest piece, really. We got to know what data is exposed by completely mapping all of the permissions. And layering this over our data classification is going to do that discovery that would otherwise have to be done manually. And we don't have to chase down those data owners, right, and ask if the data is still relevant. And then we pull our data activity on top of this, and this is going to give us our delta of who's actually using those established permissions. Now, Microsoft says that 99% of permissions in any given environment are unused. That was a study at the beginning of 2023, and the only thing I know that's changed is there's more data and AI.
Because that's what Copilot uses to determine what it has access to, is what is the user's access, right, in the environment. So if they're overexposed and they have access to things they shouldn't, now their Copilot will too. So it can mess us up at scale and speed that it couldn't before.
Yeah. And I like to say that understanding what is stale is really like the magic, right? That's going to enable you to do this mass automated remediation that is needed to deploy AI to your end users. All right, Dan, let me ask you, what did you and your team learn on your AI data preparedness journey?
Well, and we're still on it, right? I mean, we do not have this completely figured out yet. Anybody that says they do, I'd really love to speak with you afterwards. The takeaway, it has to be a program, right? This is not a project with a beginning and an end, but something that is evergreen. You're not going to start classifying your data, labeling your data, tuning DLP rules, and everything that goes with this work, right? You're going to continually do it. So you have to have people, process, and technology. And I'm fortunate to have 𝗦𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗍𝗀 here in the room, our principal security architect, the real magic behind the machine here, to put that into motion. Marty, do you want to wait for everybody? If you really want to know how things get done, find Marty. He's phenomenal, right? Have a Marty. You got to have somebody who owns this and is responsible for it and has the bandwidth and the skills and the tools they need to do the work. echoing some of your points earlier about the 3Cs, right? Our data environment's too dynamic, right? And it's that attack surface is expanding rapidly. So we have to use automation. And they have to be running those, once you get those scans and those rules configured and built, they just have to run constantly to keep up with it, right? So automation is key. I don't know how you could possibly do this manually. And you said we don't have to engage with the data owners, but I think that collaboration and communication with the data owners is a real key to success, because it doesn't capture the nuance to say our data is labeled. We found our protected health information, it's all labeled PHI, because really there's many different types of PHI, right? And they have different retention requirements and different use cases. So we have to engage with the business to understand, okay, this is this PHI that we found, and there's these people that have access to it. It's pediatric data, actually, so it's not enough to just say we're going to retain it for 7 years as we're required to for PHI, but that's when they turn 18 plus 7 years. Transplant data, behavioral health data, right? This is all PHI, but it has very different retention requirements. So you have to get in there with the data owners, because you can't get that kind of context through any tool that I'm aware of. You have to work with the business, and you have to communicate and collaborate so that they're the ones that take ownership of it, conduct those access reviews, and make sure that they are partnering with us to reduce that attack surface, that blast radius, as you called it.
Yeah. I'm going to take a moment here and talk about AI, because I know that we haven't talked about it enough here, but there are different ways to classify data. The traditional mechanics include regular expression, keywords, dictionary, exact data match, but we hear a lot about AI classification these days, and I just want you to know it is not the savior that people claim it to be. It's good at layering on additional context to our base classification results, or maybe determining a topic of a document, like this is a legal agreement or something like that. But it is no replacement for precision scanning, looking specifically for that sensitive data, and you have to use the right tool for the right job. And traditional classification is going to provide most of the coverage here. I think it has at Tampa General, and it's much cheaper computationally for scalability. And a scalable and actionable approach is what's required to protect your data. First, we have to completely and automatically discover all of your data in all of your data stores. And this is our data inventory, and we need this before we can even start to classify. Next comes the classification. And we do that with those predefined and custom classification rules. Yeah, we want to find that regulatory data, right? But you have your own versions of sensitive data, like you just explained, that are just as, if not more important.
Well, and you told me about something when we were talking in prep about how you can use the sensitivity labels to inform the retention labels. Yes. And work in Purview to do that. So again, it's a foundational thing here to turn on the lights and understand what you got, and you can actually put that into use later in the process here where we're actually mitigating risk instead of just stopping at the administrative control part of it, where we're understanding what we have but not actually doing anything about it.
Yeah, 100%. And then here comes the context, right? This is where you're gathering all that telemetry to layer on top of your classification. This is what we're going to determine. This is how we determine if data is stale, right? Has anybody been touching this data in the last 180, 365 days? And then the next thing is going to be monitoring that data activity. This allows us to spot those anomalies that could indicate a breach, like ransomware or malicious data exfiltration, but it also provides the most valuable insight into where the data is flowing in your environment so that you can craft policies that are going to stop this unwanted or accidental data sharing. I'm sure you guys see none of that, right?
None of it, but we do use Varonis's managed service to take the first crack at those alerts, right? So getting it into the detection stack and again, making this data actionable is key, and you all have been a good partner on the human side of things, right, with the managed services.
Yeah.
Since we're not staffed to do everything that we need to do, so we have to work with partners.
Right, yeah, monitoring is just the first piece. Somebody has to respond to those alerts, and we need to automatically respond at machine speed, disabling accounts, maybe isolating devices with your endpoint agents to keep it from spreading throughout the environment. And then finally, we can automatically remediate that overexposure. We can label our data and help protect this data from AI copilots. And for those of you who missed the session earlier with Microsoft Purview leadership and our Varonis CEO, we are excited to embark on the next chapter of our partnership with Microsoft and provide unified visibility into sensitive data across third-party platforms like Salesforce and more. By including Varonis signals in Microsoft Purview through direct integration with the Microsoft Sentinel Data Lake, mutual customers are going to be able to act faster, see more, and reduce risk everywhere that Copilot has access. All right, Dan, how did Tampa General approach risk once you had a full data inventory?
Well, that's, I think the right way to frame it too is to take a risk-based approach, right? And it took Michelangelo 4 years to carve the statue of David out of this hunk of marble, right, that you're starting with. And you don't start with the fine chisel, you start with a hammer and you're just knocking big blocks out.
You got to get the big chunk first.
Get the big chunks out of there, right? Like, and then you start working with a chisel and, you know, carving something beautiful. So we started with the chunks, right? You know, the stuff that hadn't been touched in 10 years, right? You know, nobody misses that stuff. Actually, 4 people missed it. But you know, we were using Varonis's data lifecycle automation tool, right, to you know, find that stale data and then move it to an enclave on the NAS where we could, you know, sit on it for a minute and make sure that we didn't do anything, you know, no oopsies in there, because you know, this is an impact to people. We're talking about touching their data, touching their access. This is very personal, but in healthcare, and I'm sure in all of your organizations too, we have the potential to really screw up some workflows, and for us that's patient care and safety. So we take those risks very seriously, and we're trying to take that nuanced crawl, walk, run approach, which again, the engagement with the data owners has been so key. So I think understanding that the classification and the labeling is just the start of the journey, and this is iterative and it's changing every day as our data, you know, growth expands, as we're generating new knowledge with these AI tools, that we have to get our arms around it, but you got to start somewhere too. So like most, we remediate the org-wide exposures. How much breach impact did we take off the table by doing that work? Do we feel that we have our arms around it enough to deploy AI tools using, you know, with where we're at now with that hunk of marble as we're still chiseling away at it, right? These are our risk trade-off, risk treatment decisions that the Governance Council is making, and we're trying to, you know, work with them in terms that they understand too. So we've actually begun to quantify our risks, to do the financial impact analysis and saying, if we move forward with this course of action, we have a 12% likelihood of a $7 million impact, but you know, I don't have the other side of that coin, the context, to say that this thing is going to generate $100 million a year in cost savings and save a bunch of people's lives. So maybe that risk is acceptable, maybe it's not, but we're able to at least present the risk in terms that the business understands.
Yeah, I think when it comes to data breaches, right, when it comes to account compromise, I think we all think of somebody getting credentials through phishing or some hardware vulnerability, however they get in, right? Mm-hmm. And then they have to go and search for this data, and we talk about how they can get into any of the data that users have permissions to. But what if that user has Copilot, right? I think this was a core thought from your team as you started to deploy this, right?
Absolutely. It's, if I wrote my social security number on a sticky note, you know, I like you, Cliff, but I'm not going to want to hand you that sticky note. I don't want your Copilot to have access to that sticky note either, right? We need to use logic and common sense with some of this stuff, but the concepts that we're applying and communicating and educating, you know, our user base on are not new. Nothing that we're talking about up here is new, right? You have to understand what you've got before you can protect it. The principle of least privilege, right? Zero trust, right? It's least privilege. These are not new concepts. It's just, it takes work. It is hard, right? But taking a risk-based approach and starting with what is obvious and then collaborating and engaging and finding out where that risk tolerance is how you get to the magic, right? Because we could have a folder with, you know, that only 5 people have access to. It's stocked with, you know, regulated data. we're not capturing that with our org-wide permission scans because only 5 people have access to it. But if only 2 of them actually need access to it, then those 3, we need to take that access away because that's a tremendous amount of risk to the organization with no upside, no business benefit for those folks to have that access. So it takes work, but you got to start with the visibility and the understanding of where your data is and who has access to it.
Yeah, and I like to say that. I've already said that I've been in a lot of these engagements over the years, and I have personally seen people kick that data security can down the road. They were deprioritized, right? And so they never really got started. They didn't even get off the ground. But
because it's hard.
Yeah,
it is
very hard.
This is hard.
It's hard, and we're working on security at the edge. We're talking with conditional access and endpoint security, and it just really took a back seat. But I think that's really caught up. Today, I think I said they caught up to the can, right? They kicked the can, now it's here, and you really have to do something about it.
That can is full of cement, but you gotta get it moving.
Yeah. All right, so how do we do this in practice? Well, we need to find our sensitive data in parallel with the context that we've talked about. Knowing that something is sensitive is never going to be enough. You have to know more than that. And by doing so, we can reduce the blast radius by well over 90% with minimal user disruption. And I'm sure all Marty had to do was just go clean up those org-wide links, and you guys were all set, right?
Just
easy. Like that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely more to it. There's about 6 or 7 different ways you can share data just out of M365. You've got your anyone links, you've got your anyone in the org links, you've got specific users, you've got direct memberships, you've got M365 groups, SharePoint groups. It's just this big ball of yarn that has to be unraveled, and you really need that visibility to make these decisions. So once we find the sensitive data with all of the context, we'll be able to reduce that. I've already said that. We can reduce the blast radius by over 90%. But next will be stopping that malicious activity and detecting threats, and so that we can implement DLP and stop those data leaks.
Absolutely.
All right. So I'm going to leave you with, I was on the wrong slide, guys, but this is the same story. So let's one more question for Dan here. What principle had TGH implemented to help guide you in your AI usage from a regulatory and framework perspective?
Yeah, guiding principles for AI, right? It has to be useful. You know, we shouldn't just be applying AI to everything that the business wants to without some context. So we've stood up a AI governance council, and it is not just a cybersecurity, domain of risk that we're looking at, because there are many domains of risk that are applicable here, right? We've got the clinical and business, validity. Are we actually going to get some benefit to the business or to our patient care by deploying this tool? What are the ethical implications, right? What are the regulatory, the legal, and the even for us as an academic health system, the educational impact of these tools? So that's a cross-functional group of executives that engage and have approved over 60 AI deployments now through our AI governance council. Wow. How to govern is probably one of my favorite topics to think about, because it's how we make decisions, right? Humans are really bad at making decisions, so we need good data, right? We need to use data, not feelings, to inform what our risks are and what our opportunities are. The regulatory environment is evolving, right? So HIPAA's not new, but there are some new regulations for us that, the FDA software as a medical device, right? We have to figure out what of these AI tools are, going to fall under that FDA regulatory purview and apply those standards, right? Because compliance isn't optional, even though sometimes some people treat it like it's optional. It's really not. Yeah. So we have to stay tight with the regulations, just like we were talking about with retention, right? A lot of that is regulated as well. I think the AI frameworks are at an interesting place right now, right? Everybody's familiar with the NIST AI RMF. There's the ISO certifications that are out there, the 42001. But those are really, if you get into those, what you would apply those for is, how is our team governing our AI risks, right? What are we doing? What are our processes and procedures to manage these systems and this risk? But it doesn't get into what is the deployment model and what are the risks that are applicable at the system level? What are the controls that are actually going to influence that those risks that are, again, relevant to the deployment model that we are planning for this system that we're trying to assess. So the Databricks framework, the 𝗦𝗲𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗃, there's a few threat modeling tools that are out there that can be used as frameworks to assist in the assessment methodology. And again, provide that consistency so that the Governance Council can understand the risks relative to other systems. And again, appetite and tolerance are important to determine, but this is also new. What is acceptable levels of risk to us right now, and how are we measuring that? So I think leaning on frameworks is important, even if they're not perfect, and they're going to continue to evolve,
Right.
but we can use those and use that standardized process and to conduct our due diligence and make sure that we're still in line with those guiding principles for AI for the organization.
All right. Well, I want to leave everyone, excuse me, I want to leave everyone with our Copilot Flight Plan that we share with clients, and similar to what you followed at Tampa General. And we've talked about a lot of this stuff already. We've got to classify our data. We need to remove and remediate that rot data, that's redundant, obsolete, and trivial data in the organization to really make Copilot more powerful. If you're feeding a bunch of, for lack of better terms, garbage to Copilot, you're going to get some garbage responses. So that's part of it as well. And we want to begin applying and fixing sensitivity labels. It is a journey, right? We're not going to finish on day one, so that's something we'll keep moving toward. And we're going to review what Copilot and agents have access to, and that's all through user permissions generally, especially with Copilot. Then we'll remediate that overexposure with automation and also those processes with your business owners to make sure that it's really locked down in a way that's safe to deploy AI. And then we'll also enable those downstream controls. We can use those sensitivity labels to feed DLP to make it more accurate and really make those policies do what they were intended to do. Now, after we deploy Gen AI, we have to do all the same things that we did before. Plus, we've got to govern those inputs and outputs, those prompts and responses, looking for anomalous and malicious activity in the Copilot itself. People asking how much Dan makes at Tampa General, or what price was this company purchased for a public company such as Varonis. Like, that would be devastating to get out. So we got to make sure that we know how people are using these Copilots. And we're going to do that by continuously monitoring the activity. User behavior analytics are very important here because you need to spot what is anomalous, right? What's out of the ordinary, and fire those alerts and have somebody that's actually paying attention to those alerts. We get pulled into investigations all the time, and there can be a Mandiant or a Blue Voyant. And when they find out that Varonis is in the house, so to speak, they'll come to us and ask, like, what data was actually impacted. And so before we had MDDR, we'd go into the Varonis console, and it was lit up like a Christmas tree, right? So that was really the inception of MDDR, so that we could take that from you. You didn't have to monitor those alerts, and we'll just escalate the things that are risky to your organization. And we'll continuously run these policies just like you said. We're going to continuously, I like to say, I did laundry before I came here, but I'm going to go home, I've got more laundry to do. As soon as you clean up these overexposures, more are being created. We need a way to control that.
Every day,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, and keep an eye on your DLP policies. Things are going to change. Requirements are going to change in the organization. And the last thing you really want to do is be someone that hinders business or stops process flows. And I've seen that a lot in these projects as well, where they'll get to a point where it's keeping someone from completing a business process, and then everything is on hold. So we need to avoid that. And then those data lifecycle policies where we're actually going in and getting rid of the data that we don't need. And it's a journey, not a destination. I know it's cliche, and you guys have heard this, but we've got to continuously and automatically classify and label our data forever, right? Like you said, it's never done. All right, Dan, any closing remarks that you would like to share before we take off?
This is hard, right? But you can get started today if you haven't already started this journey. executive support is key for this to be successful, because this is going to take political capital to get done, because we are impacting the business and the users and their data and their access, and it has to be done thoughtfully and intentionally. But the objective that we're trying to achieve by putting these programs into place in our organizations is foundational to the success of what the business wants to achieve by deploying these new technologies and these tools. This is akin to MFA, right, or encryption, right? We have to have our data footprint understood and the principles of least privilege applied to it. So I don't see it as optional, but it is tough. So you have to have the people, process, technology to build and to run and maintain a program around this. If you don't have the support from the executive team to stand that up, then there are ways to communicate the risk that they will then be able to understand what it's up against versus what you're asking, and that makes those decisions a lot easier. So absolutely encourage you to get started on this right away if you haven't, and take a hammer to those big chunks of marble, right? Just get started. You're going to take a ton of risk off the table very easily. And then when you start working with the fine chisels is where some more of that political capital and more of that collaboration comes in, but you can mitigate a lot of risk very easily and in an automated fashion with a partner like Varonis.
Yep. Perfection is the enemy of progress. I know I struggle with that myself, but sometimes getting something 80% of the way there is better than having that finished story. At least you're protecting some of your data. So thanks to everybody for coming out today. Thanks, Dan, for sharing your story. Thank you. Make sure to swing by the booth before you go so you can see how you can achieve results like Dan. And I wish you all a safely and timely trip back home. We'll be up here if anybody wants to come and say hi before our time is up here. Thank you.